good evening and welcome to Turnaround Talk's second roundtable of the year. I'm sure we are all recovering from the shock announcement that Comair is going into liquidation. I'm going to hand over to Tobie Jordaan, who is the head of the dispute resolution practice at Comair. He's also the director at CDH's dispute resolution practice. He's going to do the introduction, and then from there we will then go through it with the other panelists. Tobie, over to you.
Hello, Jonathan, and hello to everyone who's joining us. Jonathan, thank you for inviting us onto your platform today. As you said, today is a CDH show, and I'm joined by four of my colleagues who all specialize in business rescue and insolvency. First up is Roxanne Webster. She's a director and a familiar face to Turnaround Talk. We are also joined by Lucinde Rhoodie and Belinda Scriba, both directors that are based in our Cape Town office. And then lastly, Nseula Chilikhuma, or better known as Chili, who is a junior associate in our Joburg office. So Jonathan, pre-COVID, we could have never imagined an airline industry without BA and Kulula. But now this may be a reality as the final nails are being placed into Comair's coffin. So the news of Comair has certainly been a shock to the aviation industry, and it serves as a painful reminder of the effects of COVID-19. Comair held a significant market share, and we will have to wait and see if its liquidation will provide an opportunity for its competitors to rise to the occasion, to ensure that there are sufficient flights to cater for domestic travel, and also decrease the significant jobs that may eventually be lost. So with that said, enjoy the session, and I hand back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Tobie. I'm just going to remind everyone who is participating who are not panelists, please mute your microphones and to switch off your videos. Also for those panelists who are not presently presenting at the time, please mute your microphones, as this is a recorded session that will be put up on Turnaround Talk's website a little bit later this week. So let's go to Roxanne Webster. And Roxanne, I suppose with the events that happened with EdCon and with SAA, a lot of people were focusing on that, and a lot of people were focusing on how that sort of gave birth to the whole popularity of business rescue. And people really, they ignored Comair a little bit as it flew under the radar, as you said. So can you please give us a little bit of a background to the Comair rescue, and what are some of the challenges that it faced? Both those that have been common to other airlines rescues and those that are unique to Comair.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I think it's correct that Comair has not had much publicity over the past 2 years that it has been in business rescue, but certainly in the last few months we would have seen it quite a lot in the news. So let's just take a step back. On the 9th of June, the business rescue practitioners of Comair instituted an application to discontinue the business rescue process and convert those proceedings into liquidation proceedings in terms of Section 141, subsection 2 of the Act, which sets out if a business rescue practitioner believes that there's no longer any reasonable prospect of rescuing that company, he or she must discontinue those business rescue proceedings and apply for liquidation. And this is now exactly what happened in Comair's scenario. But let's just take a further step back. So as we know, Comair operated the British Airways and Kulula flights in South Africa. And it's reportedly held about 40% of the aviation market and to some extent dominated the domestic market. It then filed for business rescue in May 2020, but it wasn't the first airline that was placed into business rescue in the last 2 to 3 years. As we know, there was SAA that was placed into business rescue, and that was placed into business rescue, I think, December 2019, before we actually knew that COVID-19 was on the horizon. But Comair's situation was exacerbated by COVID-19, but also because it had a substantial debt due to it from SAA. So coupled with COVID and the substantial debt due from SAA, it was then filed for business rescue because it was financially distressed. The business rescue practitioners then prepared a business rescue plan, which was then approved by the majority of voters and was in the process of being implemented. The plan envisaged for PCF being provided by what they called the Comair Rescue Consortium, which initially provided 500 million in exchange for equity and becoming the majority creditor. They also then delisted from the JSE in order to obtain 100 million rand additional funding through the COVID-19 relief scheme. But as we know, South Africa went through various stages of lockdown and travel restrictions were imposed, which greatly affected Comair because, as I've said, they to some extent dominated the domestic market. And this is one of the factors that the business rescue practitioners mentioned as a substantial loss of revenue. So therefore, they required additional funding. They then sold their slow lounges, which we all know about, and from that they derived further funding. But the final nails in the coffin, I think, came in December 2021, where there was international bans being imposed, particularly from the UK government, where then restricted flights and connecting flights. This was particularly troublesome for Comair because they reportedly lost 100 million rand during that Christmas period. This then, with the rise in oil prices due to the war in Ukraine, and then the final nail, I think I can call it the final nail, was dealt in March of this year when the Civil Aviation Authority picked up technical issues and then grounded those flights. Now, it's reported that apparently 60 million rand was lost during those few days that those flights were grounded. All of that then, and once the 500 million or all the PCF had run out, the business rescue practitioners were unable to secure further funding, which led them to believe, or reasonable grounds to believe, that there's no longer any prospect of rescuing Comair. They were no longer able to pay their employees up until May, I think further on from May 2022, and they had then grounded all of their flights. And they immediately then brought an urgent application, as I said, on the 9th of June to place Comair into liquidation. So we saw that what is unique to Comair, I think, was the grounding of those flights and the technical issues that it experienced, which resulted in losing 60 million rand. But which is also not common to Comair, it's common to all of the airlines, was the travel restrictions, which obviously imposed, it restricted a lot of flights in South Africa, but because Comair again was dominating that market, it affected them particularly. So then we saw the provisional order being granted last week, Tuesday, with a return date of 26th of July. And this essentially says that any interested and affected parties can come to court on that date and state why they think that Comair should not be placed into final liquidation. Now, it seems unlikely that anybody can say, unless they have a feasible solution with substantial commitment from an investor, it seems unlikely that it can be taken out of liquidation. It seems very likely that it will be placed into final liquidation.
Was intense and very complicated, and I think then maybe, in respect, or giving a little bit of respect to the BRPs, in answering Numsa's question is, why could the BRPs not foresee that there would be liquidity issues at the beginning of the rescue? You've just pointed out how this sort of snowballed and happened, and nobody could have foreseen the increases in the fuel that happened from the Ukraine war. But we are going to sort of go into that in a little bit more detail a little bit later. Joining us now is Belinda Scriba, who is also a director at CDH's dispute resolution practice. And I think what we need to do is maybe go back to the Deloitte restructuring survey, where there was an emphasis on the highly uncertain economic environment created by what they call grey rhino risks, being naively underestimated to an extent that is unforeseen local and global sort of geopolitical risks. And these include stuff such as war, climate change, and pandemics. The takeaway of this finding for most people is that companies operating in this environment require agility and resilience to survive. So Belinda, thank you very much for joining us. And I suppose the first question is, can you please discuss the importance of post-commencement financing and what sort of constitutes PCF?
Okay, so PCF, as it's colloquially known, is, as you said, post-commencement finance, and it's something that's very specific to a business rescue scenario. So it's framed around the business rescue provisions in order to provide exactly what I'm going to describe now, is the granting of credit to the company after it's been placed into business rescue. Why this is unique is, for example, if a company goes into liquidation, what happens there is the liquidators are then, it's their obligation to try and get the best return on assets for the creditors. So it's basically to unbundle the company and get the best return on the assets for the company. Business rescue, it's designed to rescue a company, and a company goes into business rescue because it is financially distressed. In other words, it's cash strapped. It needs some sort of revitalization in order to continue trading. So it goes into business rescue, and not always, but generally what you require is some post-commencement finance, which is some cash injection or some credit injection into the company. So that is what post-commencement finance is. It's a creditor coming in and granting credit to the business rescue. So it's post-business rescue. And as I said, it's governed by the provisions of the business rescue under the Companies Act, specifically Section 135. It's negotiated between the business rescue practitioners and the creditor who's willing to give credit. Obviously, most creditors want some sort of form of security because the company is obviously distressed and they don't want to just be handing out finances to a distressed company. So, for example, in the specific scenario of Comair, the post-commencement financiers came in at a cost of 99% basically of the equity of the airline for the cost of 500 million. A debate of whether or not 500 million was enough. With hindsight, we can obviously say it wasn't, but I think a lot has happened after the pandemic itself, which has also snowballed into what's happened. And I don't think that you can really look at any fault in the business rescue practitioner's part as to what has happened to Comair since it went into business rescue. So I think you mentioned the Deloitte Restructuring 2002 survey that came out, in which they placed great emphasis on grey rhino risks. What are grey rhino risks? It's a term that has been coined by Michelle Walker, who's written actually a book called The Grey Rhino. And what it is, it's those high potential risks that are foreseen, but people actually don't really plan for in order to ensure the sustainability and the flexibility if that risk should actually incur. So a key example is climate change, and we see it coming. Are we preparing for it? Are we making plans to make sure that the companies are financially secure in order to deal with whatever is going to be the knock-on effect of the climate changing? So the key question here, there's a debate about whether Comair should have gone into business rescue before it did, because there were financially distressed signals already in BA before COVID hit. But whether or not you can actually point any fingers at the business rescue practitioners in terms of these grey rhino risks, it's very difficult to point fingers, because the big knock-on effects, especially for Comair post the pandemic, were obviously the ongoing rollout of lockdowns, not only locally but globally, and the grounding of airlines, again, not only locally but globally. And even though post hard lockdown there was still a lot of internal flights, our tourism industry was badly hit because there weren't incoming international flights. And we know for a fact that South Africa has a huge tourism industry, and that obviously is going to have a knock-on effect on internal local airlines. And I think BA was hit badly by the continued red notices and red alerts that were being put on South Africa as a result of the discovery of new variants and all those sorts of things. Obviously, also, what's also happened because of the pandemic and because of the riots that occurred last year and obviously the floods in KZN now, is there's been a lot of pressure that's been put on our local consumer. So there's a lot less people that can actually afford to fly right now because the cost of food is going up. Again, nobody could really have expected the business rescue practitioners to prepare over a very, it seems like a long period, but a 2-year period to prepare for potential knock-on effect of fuel prices rising because of China's continued lockdown, because of what's happening in the Ukraine. Consumers are being knocked more and more because of the food crisis that is now coming as a result of the Ukraine. So the first thing that tends to go are the luxuries. The luxuries are, flying is a luxury, it really is. So it's all of these knock-on effects, and whether or not the BRP could have, the business rescue practitioners could have foreseen that and made plans for that sooner than they did, I'm not 100% sure you can point fingers at that. Another effect on our economy, and again knocks out down to consumers, is our global credit ratings. And we all know in 2020, Moodley and Finch both put further nails in the coffin and downgraded South Africa. And this happened in November. So this was post business rescue of Comair, it was post lockdowns. So it's all had a knock-on effect on global investment in South Africa and therefore money into South Africa, and also pressure on the consumer as to what they can afford and increase in prices because of these global knock-on effects. Could we have foreseen the global, another one is instability in terms of political instability. Could the BRPs have foreseen the political instability that's going on in South Africa now? Possibly, but that's an instability that's been created over a very, very long time. And the waves that are happening now as a result of corruption and a result of people not investing and people being shy of the South African market, and therefore again impacting us locally. I don't think the business rescue practitioner could have foreseen these sorts of things. And if you look at what they did, and if you read their reports, they go into a lot of detail on how they really tried and how they thought that the 500 plus the 100 million Roxanne spoke about would be sufficient to try and trade Comair back into stability and to a place where it was no longer financially distressed. I think they did what they could. I think a lot of knock-on effects that even if they could have foreseen it, they couldn't have avoided what those effects would have caused, have just been snowballed. And to be honest, I don't know if there was any hope of rescuing Comair post all these other things that have happened past the pandemic. If it had only been the pandemic, possibly, but everything else that's happened globally and locally, I think it's been very difficult.
The question was going to be, do you think Comair was a victim of grey rhinos? And if they were, do you think that they could have, put in mitigating sort of, tactics or something to avoid them? But like as you pointed out, there were a lot of sort of moving parts that couldn't be predicted. And I think, looking outside of the BRPs, I think a lot of questions are going to be asked of governments in the coming weeks, and the implementation of the lockdown. Also of Glenn Osmond, who is the Comair CEO, was there mismanagement? Was proper truthful information given to BRPs at the time of the rescue? BRPs can only do so much with the information that they are given. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting times coming up. Let's go to Lucinde Rhoodie here, who is also a director at CDH's dispute resolution practice. Lucinda, and I've covered this quite a lot in some of my articles that I've done for Turnaround Talk. In what are some of the barriers for securing PCF?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. I think to answer this question, one must have a little bit of a background context. So I don't know, I'm sure as your listeners have seen, it was widely reported last week in the media that, Comair might actually face creditors' claims of up to 8 billion. And if you look at just that number, it puts the context of the substantial need Comair's BRPs required for PCF during business rescue into context. Some of the reasons that were given for Comair's huge creditor liability was the fact that it was undercapitalized and also that it incurred huge losses during its business rescue. And the reasons for that, both Roxanne and Belinda alluded to. So what we do know is that it is Section 1352 of the Companies Act that makes provision for PCF, and it makes provision, of course, for potential PCF lenders to obtain security for PCF funding which they intend to make available. But even although the Act makes provision for PCF lenders to get security for the credit that they are going to provide to business rescue practitioners, these PCF lenders are still faced with certain challenges. And I think the most important one is that there must be assets available, that the company in business rescue owns that can be used as security. And importantly, these assets may not otherwise be encumbered. So as a PCF lender, the first thing that you are going to look at is, are there sufficient assets to provide me with security should I provide PCF funding? Because I cannot see a PCF lender, if one is talking about the numbers that is being thrown around in the Comair business rescue, that will even consider providing PCF if there's not sufficient security. So that, I think, is the first obstacle. The second obstacle, of course, is just the ongoing daily operations that needs to be paid for. So again, as reported last week, Comair, as we know, have several secured creditors. Some of the banks are the largest, and one of the banks in the media last week said that it has an unsecured exposure of at least 250 million. So again, you can now think, if that is the case pre-business rescue, and you know that most of the creditors are secured creditors, what unencumbered assets are available to be provided and put up as security for PCF lenders? So in the absence of these assets against which potential PCF lenders, whether it's creditors, shareholders, banks, or finance houses, can register security for the PCF finance to be provided, these potential PCF lenders would be very reluctant to grant the fund. Another point is, of course, once and while Comair is under business rescue, it must be able to preserve its fleet of aircraft by paying its aircraft lessors, fuel cost, maintenance, labor cost. And we know that one of the reasons why Comair's business rescue practitioners decided to proceed with liquidation was it could not operate on a daily basis because of a lack of funding. So that means there was just insufficient income generated from operations to pay the operating costs on a daily basis. So again, in the absence of unencumbered assets that can provide security for ongoing PCF, one can really understand the reluctance. And then, of course, finally, and I think Chili would deal with this in more detail, it's the ranking of claims. Because we know if a company proceeds through business rescue and ultimately there's a business rescue plan that's adopted and implemented, at least unsecured and especially secured PCF creditors have a better ranking amongst creditors, in particularly above your pre-business rescue secured creditors. But the moment there's a risk of liquidation, your PCF providers do not rank as well as they do under business rescue. So I would say those are your most important barriers to potential PCF creditors out there in providing PCF generally, and especially during an ongoing business rescue process.
I'm a journalist and I'm no BRP myself or turnaround professional. So from the outside looking at it, and you see evidence that Comair has got 40% of stake in the market. So if they've got 40% stake in the commodity, in the sort of the capacity, why the obvious question is, why would people be reluctant to fund this if they've got 40%? It's a workable business model. But then hearing what you say, in that something has to be put up as security against that risk. What security are you going to find to put up against the risk of increasing fuel prices, where you might wake up and it's increased by 400%, maybe 800% because of the geopolitical risk that's happening around the world? So that then makes sense. It makes a lot more sense then.
Yeah. And also one must look at the nature of the assets that an airline has. I mean, one of the biggest expenses that Comair has is their aircraft, to pay their aircraft lessors. So it's where do you find sufficient assets of sufficient value that is going to satisfy a PCF lender or a consortium that's prepared to put in 500 million that appears to be too little. Yeah. I mean, it's a sinking ship to now try and convince a third party to throw more money into that business if there's no assets to secure it against. It's a big ask from PCF lenders, especially banks.
Before we move on to Nseula, I mean, my next question to you is, do you feel that Comair applied for PCF too late?
Jonathan, one always says that hindsight is 20/20 vision, and if one takes into consideration the complexity of having to operate an airline under business rescue, I think the business rescue practitioners did well to secure the PCF that they did. If you look at the time between the company going into business rescue until the time when the business rescue plan was proposed, adopted, and starting to implement, they did quite well. The first, as Roxanne mentioned, the first red flag was when the travel ban in December was imposed. And the question then is, should they have done something at that stage? I think by then your PCF creditors were already concerned and were already aware of the risks. And then, of course, the next real opportunity where they could have done something was when the Kalula and BA flights were grounded in March. But then it's almost too late to try and do something. Because, as I say, all of those factors have been, or must have been, extremely prejudicial to any attempts which the VRPs may have made to secure further PCF funding. But one can certainly not overstate the importance of timing in obtaining PCF, and also to secure, as you correctly point on, future funding lines before they are needed. But I think it's always a challenge, and the challenge would always have remained: were there and are there sufficient assets to secure PCF funding? And would there have been sufficient operating income to pay the ongoing daily expenses of the business? So, yes, they may have started attempts further, but I'm not quite sure that they would have succeeded if they asked. Especially after the delisting and the further 100 million that was injected into the business, and they were still struggling. I think there would have been problems in securing further PCF.
Jonathan, if I can also just add on to that what Lucinde was saying. So 100%. Also, if we go back to reading the business rescue application, so they had initial funding of the 500 million rand. That was in terms of the plan. They then had the additional 100 million rand that was secured through the COVID-19 relief. They then also sold, and this is when the various waves started affecting the travel bans and travel restrictions. They then started selling the slow lounges, which then brought in additional capital. But also, when the flights were then also, the travel restrictions in December 2021 came about, we'd see in the papers that in January of this year, the business rescue practitioners already started engaging with those lenders and the consortium to obtain additional 500 million funding. So that at that stage already they had probably foreseen the writing on the wall, and they started engaging that consortium for additional funding. But unfortunately, that additional funding only amounted to approximately 120 million that the lenders or the consortium is only able to provide or willing to provide. And that again, as Lucinda said, probably on the backing of there being no sufficient and substantial assets for further funding to be provided. So they did try a second round to obtain further funding once they saw that there is trouble down the line. And I think that was in January of this year, almost 6 months before they actually applied for the liquidation.
To maybe put a question to the panel from Peter Thompson before we come to you. And this is to Roxanne, Lucinda and Belinda. Why would, Peter Thompson's question is, why would / did the BRPs look at section 141 subsection 2? I don't see this as being a court-sanctioned business rescue. Was it? ? If it wasn't, why did they look to the courts? ?
So I'll take that initially, and I think Belinda and Lucinda can jump in. This was not a court-sanctioned business rescue process. It was a business rescue process that was initiated through a business rescue resolution that was passed by the board. But once we come to a point where the business rescue process is now continuing, the business rescue practitioners have drafted a plan. It has been submitted to the vote of a majority of creditors. It's been approved, and it's in the process of being implemented. And during those business rescue proceedings, if at any time during the process the BRPs are of the view that the company can no longer be rescued, or there's no, what the Act says is there's no reasonable prospect of the company no longer being rescued, that business rescue practitioner is under a duty then to, I think the Act says, notify all affected persons through the prescribed means, and that's normally the notice that goes out. And in addition to that, they must apply to discontinue those business rescue proceedings and apply to place the company into liquidation. And that's where the court comes in, because the court needs to independently assess the facts before it, that this company has gone into business rescue and process has been in business rescue for 2 years, and must also then stipulate why that company needs to be placed into liquidation, because there's a substantial amount of creditors that has gone with that business for the past 2 years, and the court then needs to award the liquidation on sufficient grounds.
Thank you very much. Belinda and Lucinda, do you guys have anything to add to that?
So I can add, I'm reading the feed now that's coming through from your listener. I think it's important to understand that once it's gone into a business rescue, whether it's via a court business rescue application, or in the case of what's happened with Comair, whether it's via a resolution, it is now in business rescue, and the business rescue practitioners are then accountable to the affected parties. And if the rescue is not working, it's accountable to the parties and to the court. It then has an obligation to say to the court, listen, we don't believe as the business rescue practitioners that it's capable of being rescued, and we are telling the court now that we have no choice but to file for liquidation. The proceedings in the Business Rescue Act set that out, that if they don't believe it's capable of rescue, they have to inform and apply to court for liquidation. You can't have a liquidation without a court order. The court has to sanction a liquidation. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so does that also apply if it's a voluntary sort of business rescue?
Absolutely.
Court appointed?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right.
And Jonathan, maybe just a final thought from my side. Sorry, I lost my connection for a couple of minutes, so please excuse if I'm way off base. But I think one thing that one must just take into account is that Comair is currently under provisional liquidation and not final liquidation. So there is going to be a return day. I think it's somewhere in July, if I'm not mistaken, when any interested party, which includes creditors, can come to court and show cause as to why a final liquidation order must not be granted. So although I think it is extremely unlikely that a final liquidation of Comair can be averted, there is still a slight chance that a rescue investor may come forward within the next 4 to 6 weeks and do a deal with the provisional liquidator. And that could ultimately lead to Comair not being finally liquidated. But I think the chances of that is very, very slim. But it's just something that I thought worth mentioning.
The whole Takatso situation with SAA, where they had that equity that they were going to put into SAA, but they were reluctant because they want to see how the company runs. They want to see what the risks are before they commit and put money into something that is going to ultimately fail. So, like you said, the chances are slim, but it might happen. We don't know. So, yeah. Nseula, let's come to you. And I think, so before we go into your question, Nseula, if you could just put on your video, Belinda and Lucinde, if you could just mute your microphones. Thank you. So, Nseula Chilikhuma is an associate at CDH's dispute resolution practice, and we're going to be talking about the ranking of claims in liquidation. And you can write literature about this because it is a significant challenge. The ranking of creditors and the claims is a significant challenge. So, I mean, should PCF be advanced and the company under business rescue goes into liquidation, how is PCF treated during a liquidation scenario? And what is the overall ranking of claims in the liquidation following an unsuccessful business rescue?
Oh, Jonathan, when you're dealing with a situation like this, there's the good news and there's the bad news. And I think a lot of people who have been recently looking to fly to Cape Town or to Durban recently got a lot of the bad news, where, especially when you're looking at consumers, because consumers rank very low on that list. Now, I mean, if you're firstly looking at the ranking of creditors, first, your secured creditors in respect to the proceeds realized from the securities, and after the cost of the realization of such securities, they're treated as first priority. So, look, the courts have reiterated recently that a secured creditor's security could not be diluted or undermined in favor of other claims, even those as business rescue practitioners, remuneration, or that of employees' post-commencement claims or PCF claims either. I mean, you're looking at further the cost of the liquidation, beyond that, the BOP's remuneration and expenses, together with the cost of the actual business rescue itself and the proceedings of itself. We're looking at, fourthly, the employees, the post-commencement claims, so the PCF claims for the employees. So all those who've been affected by receiving those notices saying that, look, the entity is no longer able to continue, even though the day-to-day operations are trying to be maintained as far as possible, because remember, the BOPs are in a position where they're looking at how to best get the best return for creditors in light of the failed business rescue proceedings. So now, with the liquidation being the best avenue, because there's no longer a reasonable prospect of success, they now need to look at how do we best realize whatever assets are available in order to get what's best for creditors out there. So, fifth, after the employees, you're looking at the post-commencement creditor secured claim. So a PCF's creditor secured claim, you're then going to be looking at your people injected income into, or injected cash into the entity or into Comair, into the situation. Now, they've had to weigh up those risks, and unfortunately, it leaves them very low on that list. They might be thinking that they'll be coming up quite higher, and in business risk proceedings, they do, like Lucinde said, they do enjoy a bit more favor, but when it comes to liquidation proceedings, they're in the medium of the list of priority in the ranking of claims. Beyond that, we look at post-commencement finance creditors' unsecured claims, so those who don't have any security for their claims, unlike maybe somebody who has a mortgage bond or a landlord's hypothec that could obviously give you some security to protect yourself. You're also looking at the cost of the execution as prescribed in the Insolvency Act, which also deals with that. And then you're looking at preference claims afforded by statutory obligations. And as we go down the list, I mean, you finally look at the claims of non-preferent concurrent creditors. So all in all, the list is very exhaustive. It's fortunately, thanks to a few recent judgments in our courts, we've been given good direction as to how these claims rank in liquidation proceedings when a business rescue is no longer able to be deemed reasonable to succeed. But all in all, for the layperson who might have a flight to Cape Town coming up, and if you may be looking at an example of saying they might get 10% of a return on whatever they paid for that flight, so it's not looking the most likely that you're going to be recuperating your money as a consumer in this instance, which is obviously unfortunate because there's people who they might have holidays planned, they might even want to just visit a relative, but unfortunately with the geopolitical situations and Comair and everything going on with fuel prices, it's been unfortunate, but this is the sad reality of what's going on right now.
Realities, and I think one of the sad realities, and I wrote it in an editorial that I put up this morning, is that this is a time where expectations are going to need to be managed. Very few people are going to see full return on their investment into this situation, and it's now sort of time to just give everyone space, give the people space to work out how much value they can get, and then from there let's sort of move forward. It's unfortunate. It's a sad reality.
No, entirely. I mean, when you'd have obviously first heard the famous jig of Kalula.com, you'd always suspected that this wouldn't be something that would ever have a failure to be a reliable airline, and it's a sad point that we're in a space where we're losing aviation companies at this time. We're losing our airlines where the operational expenses are just too vast. It's not your case of dealing with a small entity that requires, a small amount of injection. Even then, the injection of capital that's been provided with the PCF, like Lucinde mentioned, there's other factors that go on that actually have such a big impact that the reality that we're in now is brought about by COVID, is brought about by the geopolitical situation right now. And I feel for the BRPs, it's almost something that even with the right amount of PCF, and even if you secured more PCF, where do you draw the line that's saying, okay, the fuel will now cost this, or this is now what's going on with lockdowns or operational problems. So it's a sad reality indeed.
And I mean, even for like the layperson or like an employee who doesn't necessarily know how the geopolitical risk is going to impact this, it's almost like a parent with their child that comes and says, look, I got 80%. Well, why couldn't you get 90? You got 90%, but why didn't you get 100? Nobody's ever going to be 100% satisfied until obviously they get the full sort of value that they were owed.
Yes, no, completely. I mean, if you're looking at employees, they're in a position now where it would most likely be best for them to look at looking at a UIF claim, because when you're looking at liquidators trying to process all these claims and the ranking of these claims, they're still only appearing at number 4 on that ranking. So it could be a long time before they get any sort of remuneration, just in terms of making sure that they can move on from no paycheck to finding something else. So in the meantime, it would be most advisable if they go and put a UIF claim forward.
And we've seen sort of literature in the news about how Mango employees sort of struggled at a time when Mango was not able to pay their employees during, their liquidity issues. Nseula, thank you very much for your thoughts and your contribution. Thank you to my whole panel. Is there anything else that Roxanne, Lucinde, or Belinda want to add to the discussion?
I think I just wanted to just mention just now that I understand that Comair is a sad situation, yes. But if we look at SAA and compare it to SAA situation, they were given 10.5 billion rand to rescue that entity, compared to a 5 million rand for Comair. So if you look at the two scenarios, obviously Comair doesn't have deep pockets or a government that's backing it with 10.5 billion rand. So the consequences are what has now come to pass.
From Muhammad Ali to Manny Pacquiao, you're comparing two completely different sort of companies doing different sort of weight divisions, as it were.
But the government had no security whatsoever, but still provided the 10.5 billion.
Yeah, sure, 100%. Yeah, Belinda, do you have anything else to add?
I was just going to just reiterate that we mustn't look at the SAA and the Comair scenarios as being apples with apples. It's just not, because the financier for SAA was under a lot of pressure beyond financial pressure, and that's how they managed to secure their PCF. And no judgments on anybody's part as into how that happened, but it's very difficult to say why did SAA get it right and BA couldn't. In terms of the practitioners, I think it's two different scenarios, and I think people must just bear that in mind.
Yeah. Lucinda, do you have anything to add?
Maybe just a final comment, and I think it's not only a sad day for Comair and its employees, but I think also for South Africans, because I think we are in for a huge shock going forward as to especially flight prices, air tickets. I think they're suspecting that the prices may rise 3 times, 4 times what we're paying now. So it's not only the employees and the creditors, but I think South Africans are also going to pay for this business rescue ultimately.
Thank you very much. Well, look, all I can say from the outsider's point of view looking at this is that we can't compare SAA, we can't compare SAA to Comair, but we can look at each of these as a case study as to, what is the future of business rescue going to be going forward? What are some of the moving parts that need to be managed going forward? And we need to, as a profession, find ways to address these challenges and move on from all of these rescues going forward. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. A copy of this will be put up on the Turnaround Talk website in the coming days, and stay tuned for Turnaround Talk for more exclusive content.